Okay, so I spoke 2 weeks ago on whether Christians should support Israel. I wasn't able to finish, so we'll just do a quick recap and then I'll add some additional information as well. Obviously, it's very topical. If you watch the news, you'll know what's happening in Israel at the moment, how they experienced a terrorist attack, which included the rape and parading of women in the street, beheading of babies even, and yet somehow most of the world, including our country, jumped to the defense immediately of the Palestinians. And it seems that even though we're 70 or 80 years away from the Holocaust, and people said, well, how could that ever have happened? And we see exactly the same mentality today, where the Jews are somehow always the bad guys, no matter what happens. And so we saw that in Genesis 12, God made a covenant with Abraham, who was the forefather of the Jewish nation, and he promised 3 things. He said that they would be a source of blessing to the nations, that his descendants would be a great nation, and he promised him land, the land of Israel. And I showed you the many ways in which Israel and the Jews have been a blessing to the world, but the greatest blessing of all we saw was that it's from the Jews that we've received the Bible, the prophets, apostles, and our blessed Redeemer. Romans 9 says, theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah. And God promised to protect the nation of Israel. He said to Abram that he'd bless those nations who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. So that alone is good reason to support Israel, because any nation in the world, including our own, who seeks to harm Israel will face God's wrath sooner or later. And I believe that that's one of the reasons that God has blessed the USA. Despite the many problems that they have, the one thing that they have always done, at least from the government side, is that they've supported Israel. I was interested to see that not only is the USA the richest country in the world, 31% of the total wealth in the world in 2022 is in the USA. It's almost 1/3 of the entire wealth of the world is in one country, and that happens to be the country that supports Israel the most. I will bless those who bless you. We saw last time that the US President Harry Truman was the first to recognize the nation of Israel in 1948, and that Israel is the largest recipient of US foreign aid. And it's not just a recent thing. Right from the very first president, George Washington, he wrote this in his letter to the Hebrew congregations of Newport, Rhode Island. He said, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. In fact, New York has got the most amount of Jews in the world, with the exception of Tel Aviv. The 6th president, John Quincy Adams, on the right there, declared his support for the rebuilding of Judea as an independent nation. That was already in the 19th century. And Abraham Lincoln, the famous 16th president who liberated the slaves, characterized the return of the Jewish people to their homeland as a noble dream and one shared by many Americans. And every US president since 1948, since the State of Israel was established, has made noteworthy remarks about Israel. And I just took one example here. When welcoming Menachem Begin, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, to the United States, this is what Reagan said. I welcome this chance to further strengthen the unbreakable ties between the United States and Israel, and to assure you of our commitment to Israel's security and well-being. Israel and America may be thousands of miles apart, but we are philosophical neighbors, sharing a strong commitment to democracy and the rule of law. What we hold in common are the bonds of trust and friendship, qualities that in our eyes make Israel a great nation. No people have fought longer, struggled harder, or sacrificed more than yours in order to survive, to grow, and to live in freedom. And so God promised Abraham's descendants all the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. That's shown up there. They only have a small portion of it today, and there are people who are trying to take that small portion away from them. But we believe that in the future, because God always keeps his covenant promises, in the millennium, Israel will have all the territory that was promised to them on covenant by God. And so Israel has a God-given right to be a nation, and they have a right to defend themselves, as do all nations. So they're not bad when they defend themselves, when their women and children and citizens are targeted. And all we see is the fact that Palestinians civilians got hit, by incidentally. They're not targeted, whereas Hamas has deliberately targeted citizens. Now, there's a difference between deliberately targeting citizens and people being hit unintentionally because Hamas used them as human shields. In fact, they found that the Hamas headquarters has been built underground underneath a hospital. So they know that if they're targeted, hopefully the hospital will be hit and they can get some nice press out of that because they don't care about their people. And if you don't believe that God keeps his promises to Israel, what makes you think God will keep his promises to you? Do you think God's going to change his mind about the promises he's made to us? Well, why do you think he's now going to change his mind about what he's promised to Israel? And so the United Nations Resolution 181, that called for the original partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. But it was rejected by the Arabs who lived in Israel. And it was rejected by the other Arab states surrounding Israel. And so the very day that the state of Israel was declared, May the 14th, 1948, 5 Arab armies declared war on them and invaded them. Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, seeking to annihilate them. And against all odds, this new state, which didn't even have many arms, and most of the nations boycotted supplying them arms, and yet they still managed to win this war. And it was known as the War of Independence. But what happened after that war, part of the territory that you see over there was occupied by Jordan. So Jordan occupied what is called the West Bank. And that Gaza Strip you see over there was occupied by Egypt. Never ever belonged to people called the Palestinians. So at that point in time, the Gaza Strip belongs to Egypt. The West Bank, including the old city of Jerusalem, was occupied by Jordan. And the rest you see there is Israel. And it was only in 1967 that they took those territories back in the Six-Day War. We saw that in Ezekiel 38 to 39, an end-time alliance of the nations is predicted by the prophet who's going to attack Israel. We noted that we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. Is it going to be at the beginning of the tribulation? Some believe. Some believe it's at the end and they conflate it with Armageddon. We don't know. We don't have enough information in Revelation. But we do know that it's headed by Magog, which is Russia in the far north, and that the nations who join Russia are mentioned as being Persia, which is Iran. Iran, the nation that just happens to be supplying Hezbollah with weapons, supplying Hamas with weapons and inciting all sorts of trouble there and threatening both Israel and the Americans because of the recent war. And Iran is the first ally of Russia that's mentioned, and so is Libya, Sudan, and Turkey. Turkey, as I pointed out, has pretended to be a moderate nation, but in the last couple of years has shown its true colors and becoming more and more radical Muslim nation, anti-Israel. This is something that Gary sent to me that he was referring to in his devotional. Misinformation, where they try say that somehow the Palestinians had all that territory there in 1946, and that over the years it has diminished and diminished and diminished, trying to give the perception that they had this land and this land has been stolen by Israel. Is that true? Well, that first map in 1946 didn't belong to anybody called the Palestinians, it belonged to the British. In that second map, that's 1947, where the UN decided to split up the country. The British didn't want to oversee the area anymore, and that's how they proposed it be split. But it was rejected by the Arabs. The third one over there is what I just told you about. That green area didn't belong to anybody called the Palestinians. It belonged to Jordan and to Egypt. And in fact, that last map over there is the first time the Palestinians have ever in history owned any land, and that was land given to them by Israel, land for peace. So there's no such thing as them having land and losing land. And I showed you, and this is taken from Wikipedia, the history of Jerusalem, that there was never a period in history when the land of Israel belonged to any people called the Palestinians. But people are ignorant of history. And we saw that the name Palestine actually came from the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century. He didn't like the Jews. He was upset that they'd again revolted. They'd been defeated by Titus in the 1st century in AD 70, who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. But again, they revolted in the 2nd century under a Messianic leader called Bar Kokhba. And Hadrian actually renamed the land to Syria Palestina. You know why he did that? He named it after the Philistines, because he knew that the Philistines were the traditional biblical enemies of Israel. So out of spite, he not only renamed the land Palestina, he renamed Jerusalem as well to Aelia Capitolina. And so that's the origin of the term Palestine. And not only was it a ploy to identify the land with their old enemies, the Philistines, if anybody would have been called a Palestinian, it would have been the Jews by the Romans. Now, maybe you're thinking that the modern Palestinians came from the Philistines because the name's similar. Well, we saw why the name's similar. It was just because the Romans chose it. And in fact, they've done excavations in the old Philistine cities. And there you can see one in Ashkelon. And they found that there's no DNA relation between the Philistines and any Middle Eastern people. In fact, the Philistines were European. They came from Southern Europe. They're most closely related to the Greeks. There's no connection between the Philistines ethnically, linguistically, or historically with Arabia. So they're not even a Middle Eastern people. So there we have it. The infamous Goliath and Delilah were Europeans. And we know that from DNA. So who are the modern Palestinians? They're ethnically Arab, as are many Middle Easterners from the time that the Muslims conquered a lot of the area there in their holy wars, their jihads. And before 1964, the modern Palestinians were simply known as Arabs. In the partition plan that I referred to earlier, 1947, they don't talk about splitting the land between the Jews and the Palestinians. They talk about the Jewish population and the Arab population. So I've just given you a short excerpt there, but you can go Google the document. It's available online. You find no mention of anybody called the Palestinians. As I said, it's a term that's been invented to try pretend that there's a claim by these ancient people to a land where they lived before that was stolen from them, when there was never a time in history where Israel belonged to anybody called the Palestinians. Historian James Galvin, who's a scholar of Middle Eastern history, argues that Palestinian nationalism was a direct reaction to Zionism. Another thing that Gary mentioned to me as well, because this ex-boss of his that he spoke to tried to say, well, the British just took it from the Arabs or from the Palestinians. That's also a fallacy. Again, if you go look up your history, you'll find that the British took it from the Ottoman Empire, who were Turkish. And they in turn took it from the Mamluks. The Turks are not Arabs, even though they are Muslim, most of them in religion. They are a Japhetic race, not Semitic. And the Mamluks, for that matter, were also not Arabs. They were mercenaries who were mainly Turks, Caucasian, Eastern and Southeastern Europeans. There was a period in history during the Muslim conquests that they had the Holy Land, and that's the time when the Crusaders also came and for a period had it, because they drove out them, because once the Muslims had the Holy Land, they stopped pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. But no Palestinian, inverted commas, people besides the Jews, called that by the Romans. Now, what's interesting is, if you know your Old Testament, is the Jubilee year in Israel. It's significant. In the Old Testament, you'd have these sabbatical years. Every 7th year, they would let the land lie rest, have a sabbatical. And then every 7 years, 49 years, after that, you'd have the 50th year. And in that 50th year, which was known as the Jubilee year, and it would be introduced by this blasting of the shofar, as we heard a few weeks ago. And one of the things that happened there is not only that slaves were liberated, is that land was returned to its original owners. If you'd lost your land due to poverty and maybe you'd had to sell your land, in the year of Jubilee, your land was returned to you, to the rightful owner. And what's interesting is from 1517 to 1917, which is exactly 8 Jubilees, the Ottoman Turks had the land. They took it in 1517 from the Mamluks, and for exactly 8 periods of 50, they had it. And what happened in 1917? In 1917, the British liberated the city under General Allenby, pictured there in the picture. They drove the Turks out of the whole area, and after 8 Jubilees, the city was liberated. And because Turkey had been an ally of Germany, their empire was broken up, and that's when you got the formation of countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq. A lot of country land was given to the Arabs, because the Arabs were under Turkish domination as well. So it's not only that the Jews were given land in Israel, well, it only became theirs years later, but the Arabs received a great amount of land because they'd been subject to the Turks for years. And so they had all this territory, which we know today as Lebanon and Syria and Iran, Iraq, given to them because they had helped the British fight against the Turks, as did the Jews, because they were seen as oppressors. And so there you can see, after World War I, where Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the British Mandate of Palestine, all of these were taken away from Turkey because they had fought with Germany and were defeated in the World War I. After 8 Jubilees. Now look, let's put things in perspective. Have you ever seen those things? Can you find Waldo? Or can you find Waldo there? That blue strip of land is what belongs to Israel. The rest in yellow there belongs to Arabs. In fact, the land of Israel is smaller than the Kruger National Park. But apparently it's unfair that they don't have that little strip as well. And I like that cartoon. Pretty much summed up that previous one. There you can see all the chairs there, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, all the land that became Arab land after World War I. And the guy saying to the guy sitting in the Israel chair, "You sitting in my chair." Why did the Jews get the land? Well, there was an organization called Zionists, and they were looking for a homeland for Jews in the world, mainly because of the persecution of Jews and anti-Semitism. And in fact, they weren't even originally necessarily wanting in that particular area. They just wanted an independent country. And because they assisted the British in their fight against the Turks, they were promised by the Foreign Secretary of the UK, Arthur James Balfour. He wrote a letter to one of Britain's most influential Jews, Lionel Rothschild, and in what was known as the Balfour Declaration, he promised the Jews territory in what was what we know today as Israel, the original land of Israel. He promised them territory because they'd assisted them against the Turks in World War I. Another thing that was wrong with that map that I showed you earlier, where they try to pretend that land was stolen from people called the Palestinians, is that first map wasn't even accurate, because that part that you see there is Israel was not what the British Mandate of Palestine was. The original mandate was that. You see the full size? And all of that on the eastern side was given to Jordan. So already 75% of what was originally the British Mandate of Palestine was given to the Arabs. So when people say the Palestinians need a homeland, well, they've got one. It's called Jordan. They got 3/4 of British Palestine, but they want 4/4. And so that land that you see on the eastern side today is now known as Transjordan. But it was originally part of British Palestine. So after the 1948 War of Independence, as I've already told you, the Jordanians took the West Bank and they took the old city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was a divided city. The newer part belonged to Israel, but the older part, where the religious significance is and where the original temple was, and the Western Wall, was occupied by Jordan. And when it was under Jordanian rule, they refused Jews access to their holy sites, including the Temple Mount and the Western Wall, in violation of the Armistice Agreement. During the period, that 19-year period that Jordan had that area, and eastern Jerusalem, they desecrated Jewish holy places. They vandalized and destroyed them. Christian churches were prohibited from buying property in Jerusalem, and Christian religious organizations were restricted from owning property near holy places. That was the religious tolerance we had there. In contrast, the Jerusalem today even allows the Muslims to administer the Temple Mount, and there are churches everywhere with no restrictions placed on them. Now remember I told you the Jubilee, 1917. LMB occupies Jerusalem after 8 Jubilees. Well, exactly 50 years after that, 1967, we had what was called the Six-Day War, and Israel took back the whole of Jerusalem, a Jubilee, when land is restored in the eyes of God to the original owners. 1917, the British take it away from the Ottoman Turks. 50 years later, the Six-Day War, and Jerusalem belongs to Israel after thousands of years. Under Jordanian rule, as I told you, there was no religious tolerance. Jews were not permitted to live in the city. The Christian population plummeted from 25,000 to 9,000. So it doesn't sound like the Christians felt too safe in that city. Freedom of worship by members of all faiths was restored immediately after Israel took the city again. The synagogues that had been demolished during the Jordanian rule, including the Herva synagogue, were rebuilt. In July 1980, the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament, passed what was called the Jerusalem Law, and they declared the United Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. But the UN Security Council said that the law was null and void. And in a resolution 478, they called for their member states to withdraw their embassies from the city. Let's recap. 1917, 8 jubilees after the Turkish occupation of Jerusalem, the British liberate the city. And they issue the Balfour Declaration, which promises Jews land in that area. Exactly 50 years later, one Jubilee, the Jordanian-occupied old city of Jerusalem is recaptured by Israel. Exactly 50 years after that, in 2017, the US President Donald Trump ordered the relocation of the American diplomatic mission to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. 50 years again. Quite amazing, eh? 8 jubilees after the occupation, British liberate the city. 50 years later, the Jews get the city back. Another 50 years later, and the Americans say, that is where our embassy will be relocated. Against opposition from the whole world and criticism from everyone. What I found was interesting is that Trump's decision was rejected by the vast majority of world leaders. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting on the 7th of December where 14 out of 15 members condemned it, but the motion was overturned by the US because they have veto power. That woman depicted over there, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, stated that all EU member states were united on the issue of Jerusalem. She affirmed the EU's firm stance on East Jerusalem being the capital of an independent Palestinian state. I found that interesting, especially with the role we believe that the EU will play in prophecy, and where it's quite likely that the Antichrist could come out of that area. And here we find the EU objecting and saying East Jerusalem must be the capital of a Palestinian state. But fortunately, the United States ignored them. At the end of the book of Revelation, it talks about a great battle called Armageddon. Some people, as I say, conflate that with the Gog-Magog, but it's not necessarily the case. But we do know that the nations, the kings, it says in Revelation 16, gathered together to the place that in the Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, that is just a transliteration of the Hebrew Har Megiddo. There you can see the Mount of Megiddo. Interestingly, Megiddo is right next to the Jezreel Valley. And we'll go into more detail on this when we cover that in Revelation. That has been the occasion for many battles over centuries because it is a very vast plain and it just lends itself to marching infantry through it and tanks in modern warfare. And so during the past 4,000 years, there have been at least 34 conflicts that have been fought in that Jezreel Valley right next to Megiddo, Har Megiddo, Armageddon. The valley measures 32 kilometers long, 11 kilometers wide, but Jerusalem's actually the focus of the battle. So the Jezreel Valley and Megiddo is just a means to an end, and they're marching on Jerusalem, the nations. What's interesting is it talks about nations coming from the east. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And so the Euphrates forms a natural barrier, and we are told in Revelation that the river will dry up and the kings of the east will come in to join this battle to assist Antichrist as he and the other nations march on Jerusalem through the Jezreel Valley. Who are the kings of the east? Many believe that it's a reference to China. It might be an alliance that includes China because it talks about kings coming to assist the Antichrist. Now you might think, well, what have the Chinese got against Israel? Now, recent years have seen a dramatic rise in China's power and influence. They're the second largest economy in the world after the United States. They've got a very strong military. We see how they not only have intimidated Hong Kong after they got it back from the British, but they are subsequently intimidating Tibet and Taiwan, threatening to take Taiwan. But I found this very interesting from Fox News. I like watching Fox News. I don't really I agree with Trump that CNN, MSNBC are fake news. So I prefer to watch Fox News. And one of the things they pointed out is that Chinese companies have removed the name of Israel from their online maps. And that's not just something they're saying. There's actually a screenshot they give there that they show all the areas and all the countries around it. But they happen to have taken Israel off the online maps from companies like Baidu, which is a leading search engine, and Alibaba. They list Jordan, Lebanon, all the other countries. Having a look into it, it says the Wall Street Journal first reported that internet users in China were confused by the missing Jewish states. Baidu's Chinese language online maps demarcate the internationally recognized borders of Israel as well as the Palestinian territories, but don't clearly identify the country by name. That's the Wall Street Journal. And the same is true of Alibaba. They even show tiny little countries like Luxembourg, but not Israel. And it's not clear whether this development is new, but I had a look into it, and I see that China has a close relationship with Iran, and Iran, we know, Persia, ally of Magog, is a known backer of Hamas. China is actually Iran's largest trading partner. And over the past several months, they bought a record amount of Iranian oil. So isn't it amazing how we see these prophecies lining up? Gog, Magog with their Russia, with their ally Persia and other Muslim nations, and had Armageddon, the kings of the East, which is very likely China, advance on Israel. But the Bible actually predicts a time when all the nations of the world will turn on Israel. So now at least they have a friend in the United States, a few other countries as well, but the most significant is the United States. Zechariah 12 verse 3, on that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. And so we are told in Revelation 16 that in the end times, demonic spirits will go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty, and that's the battle of Armageddon. And this was alluded to in Psalm chapter 2 as well, where it speaks prophetically of Jesus' rule in Jerusalem. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. Anointed is Messiah. Saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I've installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. That's when Jesus will be established as king. And so at the second coming of Christ, at the end of the tribulation, God rises up to defend his people against these nations that move on Jerusalem. Zechariah 14:2 verse 4. 2 to 4. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west. In 1898, remember the Germans and the Turks were allies before World War I? Well, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Jerusalem. I actually found on Wikipedia that there was a local legend there that said that Jerusalem will be ruled by a king who entered the city gates on a white horse. Interesting, eh? And so in his vanity, he insisted, as you can see in the picture, on entering the city mounted on a white horse. In contrast, when Allenby, the British general in 1917, entered the city, he got off his horse because Jesus had only entered on a donkey. And he, out of respect for the city and the holy places, came in on foot. But there'll be a time in the future where someone who rode into that city on a donkey, your king comes to you on a colt, will enter the city on a white horse. And so we see at Armageddon, Jesus comes on a white horse to liberate Jerusalem. No longer the humble king on the donkey who is rejected by the city. He will come as a mighty conquering king. And then we are told that Christ will judge the nations who hate Israel. Joel 3, verse 1 to 2. Behold, in those days and that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the Valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land. Judgment for those who have cursed Israel. So should Christians support Israel or not? Well, this is what God says to the nations who oppose Israel in the end times. Zechariah 2, verse 8. For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. When you talk about someone being the apple of your eye, you're talking about someone who has a position of favor. And God says, if you touch Israel, if you touch Jerusalem, you touch the apple of my eye. And so the Bible predicts the restoration of Israel. Jesus spoke about the temple being destroyed, the city being destroyed, and he said that they would be scattered among the nations, and that was fulfilled in AD 70. But when, in 1967, the Jews took Jerusalem again in the Six-Day War, many of the Jews saw that as an event with messianic significance. But Christians recalled the words that Jesus spoke. He said they will fall by the sword, that happened in AD 70, and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And Jerusalem was trampled on by the Romans, by the Byzantines, by the Arabs, by the Mamluks, by the Turks, by the Persians. But in 1967, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It is now under Israeli rule. That tells me that we're in the end times. The times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so prophetically, the old city of Jerusalem had to come under Jewish control. There are 4 passages of scripture which describe a specific mid-tribulation event regarding the temple. And each of those passages in Daniel, in Matthew, 2 Thessalonians, and Revelation speak of a temple. The Antichrist setting himself up in the temple. Jesus says the abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place. The holy place is the Jerusalem temple. So there not only has to be Jerusalem under the control of the Jews, but there has to be a temple that will be rebuilt. And so the old city of Jerusalem coming under the control of Israel was inadvertently prophesied by all those passages, fulfilled in the 6-day war. And so Jesus foresaw the church age, where the whole world would have the gospel preached to them. Remember in the Old Covenant, the message of God went out predominantly to the Jewish people. Jesus said in Matthew 24, this prophetic passage, he said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so the Old Testament prophets, they didn't see the church age. They saw a suffering Messiah in Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, but they also spoke of a conquering Messiah, and they didn't see the church age in between. The church age was a mystery, we are told in Ephesians, not known to the Old Testament prophets. The time of the Gentiles. But what signals the end of the time? As I told you, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. We're living in the last days. And we see that as one of the major events leading up to Jesus ultimately establishing his millennial kingdom on earth. What remains to happen? There needs to be a temple rebuilt. There needs to be a world ruler who will negotiate a peace treaty in the Middle East, and then break that in the middle and set up his image in that temple that is rebuilt. And ultimately, when the Jews rebel against him and he marches on the city, Jesus comes and liberates the city. So there you can see in that chart there, Jew, Gentile, and church throughout time. The first 2,000 years approximately of history, we see God dealing with the Gentiles. Then there's this covenant relationship for 2,000 years approximately with the Jews. We're now living in a period where God is dealing predominantly with the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles. And we believe that in the 7 years tribulation, again, God starts dealing with Israel again. We believe in what's called dispensationalism, and we believe that there's a separate covenant for Israel and the church. There are people today called replacement theologians who will tell you that all the promises to Israel are fulfilled in the church. Well, that's not true, because the church has got no claim on a piece of land in the Middle East. That was a promise made to Abraham. That's a separate covenant, and God keeps his covenants. And it's quite clear in the New Testament that God has not finished with Israel, as some people will tell you. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, until the end of the time of the Gentiles, the church age. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. God is not finished with Israel. He's not nullified his promises. Romans 3, 1-4. What advantage, Paul says then, is there in being a Jew? Much in every way. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? That's to his covenant. Not at all. Let God be true and every human being a liar. Now, some people are bothered by the fact that the majority of Jews in Israel aren't Christians. There are Messianic Jews who believe in Jesus, but the majority of them don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and they're still looking for a future Messiah. And they say, well, if there is this covenant and all these promises to Israel, why don't they believe in Jesus? Well, that's because the Bible predicts a two-stage restoration of Israel. Specifically in Ezekiel 37, verse 11, if you're wondering what all those skeletons there are. Remember, Ezekiel sees a valley of dry bones, and God tells him to prophesy. And he prophesies to those dry bones. He says, I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. So they came together, but he says they still weren't fully alive. There was no breath. God then tells him to prophesy again. I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. So there's a two-stage restoration. Land restoration and then spiritual restoration. So in the 20th century, we've seen the first part of that prophecy come to pass, because it was prophesied time and again that the Jews would come back to the land. And I've got a whole lot of verses here, and because of the sake of time, which is almost up, I'm not going to read them all. I'll read you just the one from Ezekiel 36:21. God says, and he says that these dry bones represent the land of Israel. And he says, I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. And we see this repeated again and again. Go check the notes. Isaiah 14:1-2. And we see a massive influx of Jews back to the land of Israel. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Once again, he will choose Israel and settle them in their own land. Aliens will join them and unite with the house of Jacob. Nations will take them and bring them to their own place. And the house of Israel will possess the nations as men servants and maid servants in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. But then there's spiritual restoration. Because of that second part of the vision where Ezekiel prophesies, God says that represents the fact that I will put my spirit in you and you will live. After the land restoration, there comes a period where they'll be restored spiritually. I will save them from their sinful backsliding. They will be my people. I will be their God. And that spiritual restoration begins in the mid-tribulation, when they realize, seeing the abomination of desolation, the image of Antichrist in the temple, that he is not the Messiah, all the false prophets, he is not the Messiah. And we know in the book of Revelation, they flee to the desert. Isn't it interesting in Jeremiah? It says at that time, I will be the God of all the clans of Israel. The people who survive the sword will find favor in the desert. I will come to give rest to Israel. So that's portion that we're going to see when we get to the book of Revelation chapter 12 is prophesied that they will find favor in the desert. And after Jesus liberates Jerusalem, the Jews will recognize Jesus as the Messiah and repent over their previous rejection of him. If you've been to Israel, you should recognize that. It's Mount Calvary, the place of the skull, Golgotha, where Jesus, the Messiah, was crucified before. See, that's cut off a bit. But it talks about Jerusalem will look on me, the one they have pierced. The one that they crucified before. He comes back to liberate Jerusalem. Says they will look on me, the one they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him. On that day, the weeping in Jerusalem will be great, like the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. Remember Megiddo, Armageddon? Jesus comes back, defeats the nation, and they will look on me, the one that they have pierced, and they will mourn, because they'll realize they crucified their Messiah. And so the millennial rule of Christ, again, I'm not going to read that for the sake of time. Go read these passages. It talks about God putting his law in their minds and writing it on their hearts. And they will all know me from the least to the greatest. I will forgive their wickedness. Jews will no longer be despised as they are today by many. In those days, 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. Zechariah 8:13, as you've been an object of cursing among the nations, just watch the news, watch our own country, O Judah and Israel, so will I save you, and you will be a blessing. Do not be afraid, but let your hands be strong. So as we come to a close, Jerusalem is the city of peace. The Salem there is Shalom, the city of peace. And yet it's been destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, and captured and recaptured 44 times, the city of peace. But it says in Zechariah 14, verse 10 to 11, and this is speaking of the millennial reign of Jesus, Jerusalem will be raised up and remain in its place. It will be inhabited. Never again will it be destroyed. Jerusalem will be secure when Jesus reigns. I like that picture. They've taken the mosque out of the Jerusalem picture and shown the temple there. Isaiah 65:19, I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. And we are told that in the millennium, Jerusalem will rise to become the capital of the world when Jesus rules from Jerusalem. And so in conclusion, the Bible teaches that God loves Jews and Gentiles. Yes, he's got a covenant with Israel, but he also has a covenant, the new covenant at the moment of the church. John 3:16 says, God so loved the world. But God does have a special love and plan for his chosen people, and his covenant with Abraham is an everlasting covenant which he still upholds today. So be careful those who touch the apple of God's eye. Amen.